My name is Claire Monroe, and the story I am about to share begins at a wedding, where I was supposed to feel like family, but instead was treated as an afterthought. The moment is burned into me with such precision that I can replay it in slow motion. The bride, shimmering in lace and jewels, turned her head just enough for her words to carry across the hall. She does not run anything. Let her eat with the staff. Those words were not whispered. They were spoken with deliberate volume, sharp enough for heads to turn, cruel enough to draw smirks from cousins who knew better. I froze, not outwardly, but deep inside where the wound opened. My mother adjusted a ribbon on a bouquet, pretending she heard nothing. My father stared at the polished floor hands shoved into pockets that had never reached for me. My brother, his wedding, his stage, his grand performance, did not speak. Their silence was the knife. The room was exquisite. Chandeliers glittered overhead. The air smelled of roses imported from Italy. Guests in tailored suits sipped champagne as if perfection had been achieved. Yet I was escorted to a small wobbly chair tucked against the swinging kitchen doors. From there, I could smell roasted lamb, hear chefs shouting orders, and watch servers pass by with trays balanced high. It was not a mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, meant to diminish me in front of every eye that mattered. For a heartbeat, I let the humiliation settle. My chest tightened, but I would not give them the pleasure of seeing me flinch. I folded my hands in my lap, keeping my spine straight. My pulse was steady, my smile faint. The laughter around me grew. Some chuckled politely, others leaned into gossip. That was when the truth crystallized. I had not been invited as family. I had been displayed as a prop, tolerated for appearance, but erased in substance. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was still the quiet girl who fetched coffee, who saved meetings without credit, who built solutions behind curtains others claimed as their own. They thought silence was the same as weakness. But I had something they could not imagine. The final signature. The $30 million they were celebrating as if it were already theirs, still waited for my hand. The empire they toasted was not yet secured, and while they reduced me to a chair beside a kitchen door, I understood something sharper than any insult. I held the fuse. I reached into my clutch, not in haste, not in anger, but with deliberate calm. My phone rested there cool against my palm, heavy with possibility. My decision was clear before I even touched the screen. Their arrogance had lit the match. All I had to do was speak. This is where my story begins. In a hall filled with champagne and violins, with laughter that cut deeper than knives, I discovered the moment I had waited for my entire life. Not revenge for its own sake, but recognition that my silence no longer served me. I did not argue. I did not plead. I did not explain. I simply prepared. Because sometimes the most powerful act is not to shout above the noise, but to choose the precise second when 3 words can bring the entire stage crashing down. And that second was coming. Before I go on, let me pause for you. If you have ever been dismissed, silenced, or made to feel like you did not belong, this story is also yours. If you believe voices like ours deserve to be heard, subscribe and share this story, so others will know silence is not the end. The hall glittered, the music soared, but under that flawless veneer, cracks were already forming. They believed I was buried in shame. In truth, I was sharpening my voice. The night had only just begun. I sat in that unsteady chair near the kitchen door, and I let the laughter roll past me. Every burst of amusement from their perfect tables was a reminder of the role they thought I should play. Decoration, obligation, background. I was not meant to shine only to sit quietly until dismissed. But what none of them knew was that behind the calm tilt of my head and the steady rhythm of my breath, I held the final say on the very future they were parading tonight. Atlas Incorporated, the company my late father founded, was the crown jewel of my family's identity. The $30 million they toasted in crystal glasses was not secured through Jason's charm or Madison's staged elegance. It was secured because of me. I had rebuilt Atlas when it stood on the edge of collapse, pulling late nights negotiating with vendors who were ready to abandon ship and convincing investors that the company was worth saving. That contract, the one they needed, so desperately bore my name at the bottom as co-founder. Without my signature, it was nothing but paper. I glanced across the hall. Jason, my older brother, stood beside his new bride. His grin was wide-polished for cameras and guests. He was the golden boy always had been. He had been handed desks, titles, and opportunities while I was told to wait in the shadows. He basked in applause that my labor had earned. And tonight he believed the applause proved his genius. The arrogance was almost laughable. He thought marrying into the Fairchild family would guarantee Atlas's survival. He thought my cooperation was a formality. He thought that after decades of silence I would once again sit still, sign where told, and fade into the background. But as I listened to Madison's cruel remark echo in my memory, I realized I was done with silence. Done being the invisible hand that kept everything upright while others claimed the credit. I had played that part for too long. Tonight was different. The truth is, power does not shout. It waits, it observes. It chooses the exact moment to strike with precision. That power was mine now. I could feel it steadying my hands, cooling my veins. The more they laughed, the stronger my resolve became. And yet I also felt the weight of what I was about to do. Canceling the contract would not just humiliate my brother and his bride. It would dismantle the careful facade of strength my family had built. Guests would whisper. Investors would withdraw. Headlines would follow. The empire they had balanced so precariously would crumble. And I, the forgotten sister in the corner, would be the one holding the match. For a brief second I almost pitied them. Almost. But pity cannot erase decades of dismissal. It cannot undo the years of cleaning up Jason's mistakes only to be erased from the story. It cannot soften the sting of sitting in silence while my name was omitted again and again. No pity had no place here. Justice did. So I leaned back in my chair and let the storm of laughter swirl without me. I pictured the ripple effect of 3 quiet words. I saw Jason's face drain of color. I saw Madison's flawless smile falter. I saw my parents' carefully arranged masks crack. And I saw myself, not small, not silenced, but finally standing where I was meant to. I would not scream. I would not cause a scene. I would not give them the satisfaction of saying I was emotional or unstable. No, my revenge would be calm, deliberate, undeniable. It would be business. Because that is what they forgot. I was not just a sister in their family play. I was an executive, a strategist, the woman who rebuilt their empire from rubble. And tonight I would prove it. Before I reveal what came next, let me pause with you here. Tell me, if you were in my seat that night, would you have stayed silent? Or would you have acted? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because stories like this are not just mine. They belong to everyone who has ever been underestimated. The chandeliers glowed, the violins played, the guests toasted, and no one saw what was coming. Not Jason, not Madison, not even my parents. They thought the night belonged to them, but I knew better. The moment belonged to me. The phone in my hand felt heavier than crystal, heavier than the silence pressing down on me from every direction. I had made hard decisions before, the kind of calls that saved payroll and kept Atlas alive when everyone else was ready to declare it dead. But never had the weight of a decision felt this sharp, this final. All it took was 3 words. Cancel the contract. I spoke them quietly, evenly, like I was reading a weather forecast. On the other end, my investment chief did not hesitate. Understood. He knew my voice. He knew the authority it carried. With that, the $30 million deal they had paraded all evening dissolved into nothing. The air in the ballroom did not change immediately. Waiters still glided between tables. Guests still raised glasses in laughter. The violins still played their rehearsed notes. But I felt the shift subtle at first, like a storm cloud rolling in before anyone notices the sky darken. Jason's phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it at first, mid-toast, basking in the spotlight. Then it buzzed again, and again. His hand twitched as he checked the screen. I watched the color drain from his cheeks, the smile freeze on his lips. Madison leaned toward him, whispering urgently. He did not answer. He could not. My mother straightened in her chair, sensing something wrong. My father frowned, his eyes scanning the room as though searching for the source. Guests nearby tilted their heads, curious but unaware. The moment stretched tense and brittle, and then, with a sound like a blade, across glass, Warren Fairchild's chair scraped back. He rose, towering, his face a mask of fury contained in cold restraint. Adjusting his cufflinks, he said flatly, "I do not do business with amateurs." his words cut louder than any orchestra. He left the table without ceremony, his entourage falling in line behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Every guest knew something enormous had just cracked open in the middle of the celebration. Jason stumbled to his feet, knocking over his chair. "What did you do?" he shouted, his voice trembling, too loud, too desperate. I did not rush. I did not flinch. I simply lifted my glass of water, calm and deliberate, and met his eyes. I reminded them who really built the empire. The room gasped. Madison's flawless facade shattered. My mother's pearls trembled against her collarbone. My father's jaw clenched, too proud to admit defeat, too powerless to deny it. And Jason looked like a boy watching his castle burn. Because that is exactly what was happening. The foundation they had stood on for so long was crumbling before every witness who mattered. Not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but right here under chandeliers and orchids, in front of the very people whose approval they had worshipped. I stood slowly, pushing back my chair. I did not shout. I did not explain. I simply walked past rows of stunned faces through a silence so heavy it drowned out the violins still playing in ignorance. Let them whisper. Let them speculate. Let them realize too late that the sister they had dismissed, belittled, erased, had just dismantled their future with 3 words. Outside, the night air was cool, clean, and sharp against my skin. Behind me, chaos erupted, whispers turning to gasps, glasses shattering, reputations unraveling. I did not look back. I had carried the weight of their arrogance for too long. Tonight, I carried only my freedom. I did not cry. I did not smile. I only breathed steady and full. Because this was not the end. It was the beginning. Before we move forward, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been dismissed so completely that you dreamed of one moment to prove them wrong? If this story resonates, share it with someone who needs to hear that silence can become strength. I left the ballroom without regret. Inside, they were still trying to understand what had happened. They would spend the night searching for explanations. But the truth was simple. Their empire was never theirs to begin with. It was mine. When I stepped into the night air, I thought the cool breeze might ease the fire inside me. It didn't. The memory of Madison's cutting remark still echoed in my head, but it was not her cruelty that hurt most. It was the silence. The silence of my mother, who had spent her life pretending to love evenly, but always tilting the scales. The silence of my father, who looked away as though cowardice could be mistaken for wisdom. And the silence of my brother, the man who knew I had carried his failures, yet chose to let me drown in humiliation, rather than step forward with truth. But here's the thing, this silence was not new. It had been the background music of my entire childhood. When I was 8, every adult in the room called me the quiet one. Not because I lacked ideas, but because I had learned early that my words carried no weight in this family. My brother Daniel, only 2 years older, was the golden boy. He was loud, charming, impossible to ignore. He could walk into a room and claim all the air in it. I could walk into the same room with a science fair ribbon or a debate trophy, and no one would notice. At school, my straight A's lined report cards like a promise. I stacked medals and certificates in a shoebox under my bed. No one in my family ever showed up at a single award ceremony. Daniel, on the other hand, once came home with a C+ in algebra. The very next day, my mother hired a tutor, and my father declared he had potential in math. I remember applying for college. I asked my father to glance over my essays. He waved a hand and said, "You will figure it out. You always do." Daniel had 3 adults poring over his applications, plus a paid counselor to coach him through interviews. It was not that they despised me. That would have been simpler to accept. It was that they never saw me, not clearly, not fully. They treated me like insurance, reliable, invisible, expected to hold everything together, while they admired Daniel's shine. I adapted. I thrived in shadows. I stopped expecting attention. I worked quietly, consistently, invisibly. When our father launched Atlas, Daniel was given a desk, a title, and glossy business cards before he even graduated high school. I was in college juggling classes and part-time jobs. I offered to help with accounting, logistics, even marketing. My father told me, "We will call you when we need you." Years passed. They never called. Not until the market crashed. Not until Atlas teetered on the edge of ruin. That was when Daniel called, not as a brother, but as a desperate man. I walked into an office that looked like a sinking ship, unpaid vendors, empty desks, nervous staff already polishing resume, Daniel's face pale with fear. I did what I had always done. I fixed what others broke. I cut costs, streamlined vendors, restructured debt. I convinced investors who trusted me, not Daniel, to put money back into Atlas. Within weeks, the company stabilized. Payroll cleared, morale returned, and Daniel. He went on television with the company logo glowing behind him and told reporters, "We adapted. I made hard decisions. My name was never mentioned. My fingerprints were everywhere, but my face was nowhere." That pattern carried through every Thanksgiving, every board meeting, every family dinner. If Daniel broke curfew, I was lectured. If he wrecked a car, my parents demanded to know how I let it happen, even if I was 3 hours away at college. At home, I was expected to clear dishes quietly, while Daniel told the same exaggerated stories rewarded with laughter. Once I tried to speak about a nonprofit incubator I dreamed of starting. My mother changed the subject mid-sentence. My father asked for salt. Daniel cracked a joke about my old car, and the table erupted with amusement. That night, I stopped speaking up, not out of bitterness but clarity. Some tables are never set for you. You are only expected to serve clean and vanish. And yet every time they pushed me down, they taught me a truth I would later use against them. The quiet one sees everything. The overlooked one builds strength no one expects. And the invisible one, when she finally chooses to act, becomes unstoppable. If you've ever been the overlooked one in your family, if you've ever been the quiet one expected to stay small, share this video. Because sometimes the quiet ones carry storms, and when they rise, no one is ready. I left the wedding knowing this truth had always been there. Tonight only made it visible. Their silence was not new, it was just finally unbearable, and that is why when the chance came I no longer hesitated. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Atlas had never stumbled, if the company had sailed smoothly under Daniel's careless hand. Maybe I would have remained a shadow forever, fixing small messes in the background, never daring to demand my place. But fate, or maybe incompetence, had other plans. The first true collapse came after our father's death. Without his steady presence, Daniel was lost. He had the title, but not the skill. Investors grew restless, vendors withdrew, payroll lagged. For the first time, the golden boy's shine began to crack. That was when the phone call came late at night, Daniel's voice stripped of pride. "We need help." I still remember walking into that office, empty cubicles, the silence of fear hanging in the air, assistants avoiding my eyes, files stacked high with unpaid bills. It felt like entering a battlefield after defeat. Daniel tried to look in control, but his hands shook as he admitted the truth. We are 30 days from collapse. I knew better. It was closer to 15. I rolled up my sleeves and did what no one else could. I combed through accounts, uncovered duplicate vendors, bleeding money, and renegotiated contracts others had abandoned. I reached out to investors who had long ignored Daniel's calls, but who trusted me because I had always treated them with respect. I convinced them Atlas still had a future worth saving. $17 million came in within 3 weeks. Payroll cleared, vendors returned, operations resumed, Atlas breathed again. But when the press arrived, it was Daniel's face that graced the covers. A business magazine ran a full spread, the young CEO who rescued his father's legacy. His jawline sharp arms crossed Atlas logo glowing behind him. I read it twice. Not once did my name appear. Not as part of the executive team, not even as a silent advisor. I had saved the company, yet I remained a ghost. When I asked Daniel about it, his answer was dismissive. You know how these things go. Reporters simplify. It is about the brand. What he meant was clearer: your work is valuable, but your name is inconvenient. That was the moment I realized my role had been cemented. I was the fallback, the fixer, the invisible foundation no one applauded. And the cruelest part, my family preferred it that way. The board knew. The executives who remained knew. The assistants who saw me rewriting financial models at midnight knew. Yet no one spoke up. They all shrugged, offered soft apologies. It is politics. You know how it is. Yes, I knew exactly how it was. The man with the name was celebrated. The woman who saved everything was erased. At home, nothing changed either. During Thanksgiving, Daniel told his version of events at the dinner table. My parents beamed with pride. My mother even teared up, saying, "Your father would be so proud of you." I opened my mouth to say something, just one thing, but my father cut me off, asking if I could pass the cranberry sauce. My words dissolved in silence again. The lesson was written in bold ink across my life. Daniel was the face, I was the fallback. He was the empire, I was the invisible scaffolding. They had chosen roles early and never once thought to question them. But deep down I knew something they did not. Empires built on silence are fragile. They believe they can erase the hands that hold them up. They never realize that those same hands can also let go. I began to prepare, quietly, carefully. I stopped offering solutions at board meetings. I stopped fixing mistakes before they spiraled. I let Daniel stumble through earnings calls I used to script. He thought I had grown complacent, dependent on Atlas for purpose. The truth was different. I was building purpose elsewhere. I formed new partnerships under my own name. I attended meetings Daniel did not know existed. I networked outside the Atlas circle. Every deal, every handshake, every connection was mine alone. Because one day I promised myself the silence would end. Tell me, if you were in my position, would you have kept saving Atlas in secret or let it collapse? Leave a comment, because choices like these reveal who we really are. Daniel thought his empire was untouchable. My family thought their silence would last forever. But in truth, the countdown had already begun, and I was the one holding the clock. The months that followed were some of the strangest of my life. On the surface, Atlas seemed stronger than ever. Jason, my brother, stood at podiums shaking hands with investors, giving interviews about resilience and innovation. My parents attended every event front row, their faces glowing with pride. To the world, Atlas was the golden empire carried by a golden sun. But I knew the cracks beneath the marble. I had seen the balance sheets. I had patched holes in the dam more times than I could count. Every time Jason smiled for a camera, I remembered the nights I sat alone, red-penning contracts and running projections to stop the company from sinking. At home, the same silence played out, but now it cut deeper. If Jason forgot a meeting, it was my fault for not reminding him. If he overpromised to investors, it was my responsibility to find a way to deliver. Even his reckless nights out somehow landed in my lap. I became the family's built-in scapegoat. One Thanksgiving, he drove drunk and plowed into a neighbor's fence. My mother cried, my father raged, and then they turned to me. "How could you let this happen?" they asked, as though I was behind the wheel, as though I lived to absorb his sins. I was 3 hours away at college, but logic never mattered in our house. The roles had already been written. Jason was the hero, I was the shadow. Even at family dinners, the pattern held. Jason arrived late, spinning the same old stories. Everyone laughed at his recycled jokes. I tried once, just once, to talk about a nonprofit incubator I wanted to build. My mother interrupted to change the subject. My father reached for salt. Jason cracked a joke about my old car. And the table erupted again, this time at my expense. That was the night I stopped offering ideas. Not because I lacked them, but because I understood the truth: some tables will never let you belong. You are not meant to eat. You are meant to serve, to clear plates, to fade away. I thought I had made peace with that truth. But sitting by the kitchen doors at his wedding, hearing Madison's words ring through the hall, I realized I had not. That humiliation was not an isolated insult. It was the culmination of every moment they had ignored me, every idea dismissed, every sacrifice buried in silence. And yet, instead of breaking me, their silence had forged something stronger. Patience, precision, a kind of steel that only forms under years of pressure. I had learned to see what others ignored, to notice what others overlooked, and slowly I had begun building something of my own. While Jason soaked in praise, I started investing in places no one cared to look. I backed small founders working out of diners, women and men who were turned away by every major fund. I did not need my name on stages. I needed documents signed, equity-secured networks woven. Bit by bit, I built a lattice of companies tied not to Atlas, but to me. Jason thought I stayed silent because I had nowhere else to go. He thought dependence kept me tethered to him. What he never understood was that I was waiting for the moment their silence became unbearable, waiting for the day their arrogance handed me the perfect opening. And that moment had come at his wedding. If you have ever been blamed for someone else's mistakes, if you have ever been expected to carry burdens you did not create, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments, because silence hides too many scars. Jason believed my silence meant surrender. My parents believed their silence was safe, but silence is never safe. It cuts both ways. And one day, it would cut them. The first time I heard about Charlotte Fairchild, it was not from my brother. It was from the headlines. Atlas's young CEO, Jason Monroe, was suddenly engaged to the heiress of one of the most powerful investment families in the country. The newspapers called it a whirlwind romance. Two brilliant dynasties joining hands. A love story wrapped in diamonds and satin. But I knew my brother better than anyone. Jason did not believe in love stories. He believed in leverage. And Atlas had been wobbling again. Behind the glossy reports and staged interviews, the numbers were starting to show cracks. Credit lines stretched thin. Vendors whispering about late payments. Projects forecasted with optimism that had no foundation in reality. I had raised the alarms in private memos. The board ignored me. Jason pretended the problems did not exist. And then, as if by miracle, a solution appeared. Her name was Charlotte, but her real value was her father, Warren Fairchild, a man famous for swooping in with capital when companies staggered. He always came with conditions that preserved his power and protected his empire first. Jason had not fallen for Charlotte, he had fallen for her father's money. At first I stayed silent. If Jason wanted to sell his future in exchange for a lifeline, that was his choice. But then a longtime legal advisor, a man who owed me more than one favor, called me with news. He had been asked to draft a clause in the merger proposal, a clause that shocked me. It stated that any future strategic growth plan of Atlas would require the approval of both the CEO and its co-founder. An unnamed role in the media, but written clearly in legal ink. My name. The Fairchilds had done their homework. They knew who had kept Atlas alive. They did not trust Jason alone. They wanted my hand on the pen. That was when the puzzle locked into place. This engagement was not romance. It was a contract negotiation. Jason had not proposed with love. He had signed a deal for survival. And I, the sister he had spent his life ignoring, was the final condition. What made it worse was how I found out. Not through family, not through Jason, not even through the board. I discovered it in paperwork, cold, impersonal, transactional. My role reduced to a line item. My signature valued not because I mattered, but because I was necessary. When I confronted Jason privately, he shrugged. "Don't make this difficult. It's just a formality. We need this deal." He looked at me the same way he did when we were children, expecting me to cover for him, to clean up, to sacrifice quietly. But I was not 8 anymore. I was not the silent one in the corner. I was the woman who had built empires he took credit for. The insult was deeper than Madison's cruel words at the wedding. Because this was not just personal, this was calculated. They wanted my silence, my surrender, my signature, and then my disappearance. But I had already begun something they could not see. The Olivia Group, my own lattice of companies, investments, and partnerships, was already stronger than they imagined. And while Jason believed he had cornered me into compliance, he had really walked straight into a trap of his own making. Let me pause here. Imagine this. Your family hides a contract that ties your future to theirs, knowing you are the key they cannot move without. Would you sign out of loyalty, or would you hold your ground? Drop your thoughts below, because choices like these reveal who we become. Jason saw Charlotte's smile as his salvation. My parents saw the Fairchild money as their security. The board saw it as stability. But I saw it for what it really was, chains dressed in satin, and I had no intention of wearing them. The email came on a gray morning, one of those mornings where the sky hangs heavy and the world feels quiet, as if holding its breath. I was sipping coffee at my desk, the merger papers neatly stacked in front of me, when the notification pinged. At first, I almost ignored it. The subject line looked routine FW signature confirmation request. But when I opened it, the world shifted. Buried inside the thread was a message Charlotte Fairchild had intended for Jason alone. Somehow, she had accidentally copied me. I read it once quickly, then again slower this time, as though the words might soften with repetition. They didn't. Once she signs we're done babysitting her, she'll be irrelevant. My fingers went cold. My chest tightened. For years I had convinced myself that being used was better than being discarded. But here it was, in black and white, the truth stripped of pretense. They never intended for me to be part of the future. I was not a partner. I was a checkbox, a temporary necessity. I pushed back from my desk and stared at the papers. The neat fonts and bindings suddenly looked absurd, like props in a theater where I had been cast in a role I never auditioned for. For a moment, I almost shook with anger, but then something inside me steadied. My spine straightened, my breath evened. And then I laughed, not softly but sharply, the kind of laugh that comes when a mask finally drops and you see the play for what it is. They thought I was trapped. They thought I had no choice but to sign. They thought the girl they had erased, sidelined, diminished, would do what she had always done, save them, then vanish. But this email changed everything. I forwarded the thread to my private legal advisor with a single instruction: hold everything. Then I smoothed my blazer, and left the documents untouched on the desk. Somewhere across the city, Jason was probably refreshing his inbox, waiting for confirmation. Charlotte was probably rehearsing her triumphant smile, imagining the Fairchild Empire tethered neatly to Atlas. They assumed I was doing what was expected, but for the first time I had no intention of playing their script. It struck me then how poetic it was. For years, silence had been their weapon. They silenced my voice at dinners, silenced my credit in boardrooms, silenced my existence in their narratives. Now silence would be mine. My refusal to sign, my decision not to explain, would thunder louder than any speech I could give. 'Cause silence cuts both ways. That morning, as the city woke around me, I realized they had handed me more than betrayal. They had handed me freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you stop begging for recognition and start building your own stage. And the best part, they didn't even know it yet. Let me stop here to ask you, have you ever discovered someone's true intentions by accident, like an email or a message that revealed the mask? What did you do? Share it below, because those moments change us forever. I closed the folder on the merger papers. The pen sat unused. The signature line stayed blank. They thought my cooperation was inevitable. But inevitability is a lie. Choice is power. And I had just chosen. I had always believed invisibility was a curse. But in the weeks after I refused to sign the merger, I began to see it as a weapon. You learn strange skills when people ignore you. You learn how to move quietly, how to listen when others boast, how to build foundations while others chase applause. And in that silence, I had built something Jason and Charlotte could never imagine. It didn't start with some grand design. It began in a diner near a train station with two founders named Maya and Louis. They couldn't even afford parking at the downtown towers. Their pitch was clumsy, their clothes worn. But when I asked them to walk me through their worst-case scenarios, their answers were sharper than any polished deck I had seen. I wrote them a check through a Delaware LLC with an unremarkable name. 18 months later, their software was running behind mid-sized banks. For the first time, they paid themselves real salaries. They called to thank me, not an institution, not a faceless fund, but me, by my first name. That was the start of what became the Monroe Group, a lattice of investments stitched together carefully, deliberately, always under the radar. A warehouse renovator here, a micro-lending innovator, they're a fintech founder, obsessed with fairness. None of them flashy enough to make magazine covers. All of them strong enough to matter. I set rules for myself. No vanity, no headlines. Clean documents, fair terms, equity that protected workers, not just executives. I took observer seats only when necessary. I stepped out of photos. I declined press releases. Because power grows best when it doesn't crave spotlight. While Atlas was propping itself up with staged interviews and Charlotte's diamond smile, my companies were putting down roots. Quiet roots, the kind that hold when storms come. Jason believed I stayed because I had nowhere else to go. In truth, I stayed because patience is not surrender. Patience is strategy. And that's why by the time the Fairchild wedding arrived, I no longer needed Atlas. The vendors Jason courted, I already had relationships with them. The startups he bragged about discovering, I had written checks before he even knew their names. The properties Atlas planned to lease. They sat quietly inside my portfolio. I had turned invisibility into leverage. So when I sat at that wobbly kitchen-side chair at his wedding hearing Madison's cruel voice, I wasn't broken. I was sharpened. They thought humiliation would reduce me to obedience. but humiliation had been my training ground. Before I go further, let me ask you this. If you had built a secret empire while everyone ignored you, would you reveal it or keep it hidden until the right strike? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Jason loved to remind me of his golden role, as if repeating it made it true. My parents clung to the illusion that he was the empire and I was the fallback. But I had already outgrown their narrative. I wasn't begging for their recognition anymore. I was building something larger, something freer, something they would only see when it was too late. And soon the moment to reveal it was coming. They thought I was the silent sister at the kitchen table. They had no idea I was the architect of a skyline they couldn't even see. The night before the wedding, there was a dinner meant to project unity. It was staged at a restaurant my father had once loved. But the warmth that had once lived in its walls was gone. The chandeliers gleamed, the wine flowed, and the laughter felt rehearsed, like lines delivered on a stage, rather than emotions shared at a table. From the moment I walked in, I could feel it. This was theater carefully arranged to show the Fairchild family that we were solid, unbreakable one. But unity had never lived in our family. My mother greeted me with a half embrace that ended before it began. Her perfume was sharp, familiar, suffocating. She sat across from me, her pearls catching the candlelight, her lips curling into a smile that never reached her eyes. When the chatter dipped for a brief moment, she leaned forward, her voice low enough for only me to hear. "Don't cause trouble tonight. Just do your part." Her tone wasn't scolding. It was worse, it was dismissive, as if my very presence was an inconvenience. I didn't respond. I lifted my glass of water, let the silence stretch, and kept my gaze steady. Silence had become my armor. Jason arrived late as always, carrying Charlotte's hand like a trophy. He guided her into the room with a proud tilt of his chin, basking in the applause that followed his entrance. He began recounting his journey, painting himself as the savior of Atlas, the heir to our father's vision. Every story was polished, every detail carefully shaped for Warren Fairchild's ears. At one point he turned toward me, smirking. Sometimes the best contribution is knowing when to stay quiet. The words cut sharp. The table chuckled politely, pretending it was sibling banter. But I saw the flicker in Charlotte's smile, the faint nod from my mother, the silent approval from Warren, who said nothing but absorbed everything. They thought I would sit small at the end of the table, nodding along, playing my role. What they didn't know was that my decision had already hardened into stone. The email from Charlotte, her careless arrogance, her confidence that I would sign and vanish, still replayed in my mind like a loop I could not turn off. Once she signs, we're done babysitting her. She'll be irrelevant. That night, as Jason raised his glass to toast family, I raised mine too. But my thoughts were elsewhere. Not to family defined by blood and silence, but to the lattice I had built quietly, the founders who trusted me, the companies that bore my fingerprints, the empire they didn't even know existed. Dinner dragged on. Toasts, laughter, shallow words. To anyone else, the evening looked like a portrait of strength. But I knew better. Every smile was a mask, every word rehearsed. And as I sat in silence, I let them believe they had won this round. But I also knew they would remember this night differently. Not as a performance of unity, but as the last time they mistook my silence for weakness. When dessert arrived, Jason raised his glass again. To family, he declared. Glasses clinked all around me. I lifted mine slowly, my smile faint. To family, I whispered. But in my heart, the word had already been redefined. My loyalty belonged elsewhere now. If you were seated at that table, knowing you had the power to end their show, but choosing silence instead, what would you have done? Drop your answer in the comments, because silence can be sharper than any sword. That dinner was their rehearsal for a victory they thought was certain. They believed my silence was submission, but I had already chosen my path. Tomorrow they would learn just how wrong they were. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, the kind of day photographers pray for. To the outside world it looked perfect. Rows of orchids lining the walkway, waiters in crisp white uniforms, violins carrying Mozart through the air. The Fairchild estate had been transformed into a palace of elegance, a stage for wealth and permanence. But for me, every detail was another reminder that I did not belong to their vision. I arrived on time, not early enough to seem eager, not late enough to attract whispers. The ushers glanced at my invitation, exchanged a look, and gestured vaguely toward the back. My name was missing from the calligraphed place cards set out across the elegant tables. After a few minutes of confusion, a planner pointed me to my seat. When I finally found it, I almost laughed. A small table tucked beside the swinging kitchen doors, close enough to hear chefs shouting orders and smell the steam from trays. My chair wobbled on the uneven floor. There was no folded napkin, no name card, just a plain seat, set apart as though I were part of the hired staff waiting for my shift. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, deliberately. If they expected protest, they would be disappointed. I would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. My silence would speak louder. And then it happened. Charlotte, radiant in lace and jewels, glided past at that exact moment. She paused, ensuring her voice carried just far enough. "She doesn't run anything. Let her eat with the staff." The words cut through the music like a blade. For a second, the violins seemed to falter, or maybe it was just the roar in my ears. I looked around. My mother lowered her gaze, lips pressed thin. My father sipped his drink. Jason kept his eyes fixed ahead, pretending not to notice. A few cousins smirked behind their napkins. The laughter started small, then rippled outward like a cruel tide. It wasn't her insult that hurt most. It was the silence of everyone who should have defended me. The silence of family. That silence cut deeper than any single word. I folded my hands in my lap, my face calm, my back straight. But inside, I engraved every detail into memory, the wobble of the chair, the smell of garlic and lamb, the sting of being erased in plain sight. I wanted to remember how it felt, because it would make what came next even sharper. The staff passed by me again and again, Trey's high eyes flicking toward me with quiet sympathy. Even they understood what this seat meant. It wasn't oversight. It wasn't accident. It was punishment, disguised as dismissal. Jason raised his glass for a toast. His voice boomed across the hall, thanking the Fairchilds, praising Charlotte, celebrating Atlas. He did not thank me. He didn't even acknowledge me. To the room, I did not exist. But I did, and I was watching. I smiled then, just slightly. Let them believe they had cornered me into silence. Let them laugh. Let them whisper. Because the truth was far simpler, their silence had freed me. Tell me this, have you ever sat at a table where you were made to feel invisible? Did you swallow the insult, or did you decide it was the last time? Share below, because your silence may hold more power than you know. The violins swelled, the chandeliers glittered, the laughter echoed. But beneath it all, the ground was already shifting. They thought the humiliation would bury me. Instead, it prepared me. The laughter from the other tables still rang in my ears when I reached into my clutch. My hand was steady, my pulse calm, even as violins swelled overhead and champagne glasses glittered like nothing in the world could shatter. Everyone thought I had been humiliated into silence. They could not have been more wrong. That silence was not surrender. It was the sharpened edge of my resolve. The phone slid easily into my palm, its weight reassuring, the kind of weight that carries consequences. I pressed a single contact. The call connected after one ring. My voice was even deliberate, clear enough that the moment would echo forever in my memory. Cancel the contract. 3 words, spoken low, spoken final. On the other end, the head of investments did not question me. He knew my authority. Understood, he replied. I ended the call before the applause around me had faded. At first, nothing seemed different. The waiters still carried trays. Guests still toasted to Jason's brilliance. The chandelier still poured light over the celebration. But then the shift began. Subtle, almost invisible, like the air tightening before a storm. Jason's phone buzzed on the table. He ignored it. Then it buzzed again, and again. His hand twitched as he picked it up. His smirk faltered. Color drained from his cheeks. Charlotte leaned close, whispering sharp questions. Jason's hand trembled. His grip on the glass stem tightened so much I thought it might break. My mother frowned, sensing a ripple in the air. My father's eyes narrowed, trying to read what he could not yet see. Guests exchanged puzzled glances. And then it happened. The sharp scrape of a chair cut through the room, louder than any violin. Warren Fairchild stood, his jaw set, his expression cold fury. He adjusted his cufflinks, his voice flat, but damning. I don't do business with amateurs. No toast, no congratulations, just condemnation. He turned on his heel, his entourage following like shadows. The silence that fell afterward was heavier than any insult I had endured that night. Guests whispered, heads craned, uncertainty rippling across the hall. Jason stumbled to his feet, knocking his chair over. "What did you do?" he shouted, voice trembling, too desperate to mask the panic. I lifted my glass of water, calm, unhurried, and met his eyes. I reminded them who really built the empire. The words were not shouted, but every person in that hall heard them. Charlotte's flawless facade crumbled in real time. My mother's pearls trembled against her chest as her breathing quickened. Cousins avoided my gaze, smirks gone. And Jason, the golden boy, the untouchable heir, looked like a child watching his castle burn. Because that is exactly what was happening. The foundation of their future was gone. With one phone call, one decision, the $30 million deal they had built their legacy on vanished like smoke. I pushed back my chair, stood tall, and walked through the room. Every step deliberate, every eye following. I didn't shout, I didn't argue, I didn't explain. I let the silence of my leaving speak for me. The sister they had mocked, the daughter they had ignored, the co-founder they had erased. I had just ended them with 3 words. But before we go further, here's my question to you. If you were holding the power to end an empire built on your silence, would you use it or would you forgive? Leave your answer below, because this is not just about business, it's about dignity. Behind me, chaos bloomed. Warren Fairchild gone, Jason unraveling, Charlotte collapsing, my parents frozen, their empire in ashes, and I was already outside breathing freely for the first time in years. The air outside was crisp, almost too clean after the suffocating weight of the ballroom. I stood there for a moment, listening as muffled chaos began spilling from the hall. Shouts, whispers, hurried footsteps. It was the sound of an empire crumbling in real time. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply breathed. Because what I had set in motion was bigger than revenge. It was truth, finally breaking free. Inside, Jason was unraveling. His phone lit up with messages from investors pulling out directors demanding explanations, suppliers refusing guarantees. He tried to steady himself, his voice cracking as he whispered frantically to Charlotte. But Charlotte was no longer the flawless bride. Her perfect smile had collapsed. She was pale, trembling, realizing she had tethered herself to a man without power. Guests shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of something historic. Some leaned in to gossip, others avoided my family's table altogether. And then Warren Fairchild's exit began to ripple. His condemnation. "I don't do business with amateurs" was already being repeated from table to table. What had been a wedding toast turned into a public autopsy of Jason's credibility. Jason rose pale and desperate, knocking over his chair. "What did you do?" he shouted again, louder this time, his voice breaking. He looked around the room for support, but none came. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips, eyes darting, unable to form words. My father glared, but his silence was hollow now. No authority, no command, just shame. I did not stop walking, but before I reached the door, I turned once, not for them, but for the record. My voice carried calm and deliberate. I reminded them who really built the empire. Gasps spread like fire through the hall. Those words quiet as they were detonated, louder than Jason's frantic cries. For the first time, the world saw what had been hidden for years, that the Golden Boy's empire was built on sand, and the sister in the shadows had just pulled the tide. Charlotte's eyes widened, mascara streaking as she clutched Jason's arm, hissing words through clenched teeth. He shook his head, sweat beading under the lights, unable to answer her. Guests began excusing themselves politely, unwilling to stay tethered to a sinking ship. The music faltered, the violins trailing off as if even the musicians felt the collapse. I stepped outside, heels clicking against the stone path. Behind me, voices rose, anger, confusion, panic. The show was over. The carefully crafted image of Atlas as unshakable was gone, not in a boardroom or a courtroom, but in the very hall where they had humiliated me. For years, Jason had believed silence would protect him, that my silence meant surrender. Tonight, silence had destroyed him. And this was only the beginning. Now pause with me here. Imagine watching the person who dismissed you for years crumble in front of their entire world. Would you feel triumph or would you feel pity? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how you would carry that moment. The Fairchilds left without ceremony. Investors whispered their exits before dessert had even been served. My parents sat frozen, unable to piece together the fragments of a legacy they thought untouchable. And Jason, his face pale, his suit wrinkled, his hands trembling, looked less like a CEO and more like a boy who had just realized the world no longer believed his story. Inside the hall, the empire was collapsing. Outside, I inhaled the night air and let the weight fall away. They had tried to bury me in silence. Tonight, I buried them with it. By the next morning, the whispers had already turned into headlines. The story spread faster than champagne could go flat. Fairchild Capital withdraws commitment. Atlas merger collapses at the altar. Golden CEO exposed as hollow. Reporters swarmed like vultures sensing blood. What had begun as quiet murmurs in a ballroom became front-page humiliation before dawn. The markets are merciless. Atlas stock opened in free fall. 20% gone before lunch, another 15% by closing. Emails that once carried congratulations now carried terminations. Partners suspended deals. Suppliers demanded guarantees Jason could not give. For years, Atlas had been balancing on invisible scaffolding that I alone held steady. Now, with one refusal, one withdrawal of my support, the structure collapsed in public view. Jason scrambled. He called an emergency board meeting demanding loyalty. But one director excused herself with a prior engagement. Another claimed his connection was poor and never rejoined the line. The screen filled with empty squares, silence replacing the applause he had once commanded. For the first time, Jason realized what it felt like to be invisible. The press feasted. Photos of Jason at the altar grinning like a king ran side by side with plunging stock tickers. Anchors dissected every detail, speculating about hidden fractures, mismanagement, betrayal. The same words he had once used to describe me were now stapled to his name. By evening, my phone rang. My mother. Her voice was frantic, cracking under a weight she could no longer carry. Why, she whispered. Why would you do this to your own family? I let her stumble over words, her tone soaked in desperation. Then I answered slowly, each word sharp enough to cut. Because you let me sit by the kitchen. Silence, not confusion, recognition. She knew exactly what I meant. Every dismissal, every insult, every time they chose to look away instead of stand beside me. All of it distilled into one image, a chair by the swinging kitchen doors. She tried to reply, but no sound came. For once, my mother, the woman who always had explanations, justifications, excuses, was speechless. The next day, Jason held a press conference. Sweat beaded under the studio lights. He spoke of resilience, of temporary setbacks, of loyalty and faith. But behind him, screens flashed real-time data of Atlas crumbling. Reporters shouted questions. Why was the deal canceled? What role did your sister play? Did you mislead investors? His voice cracked. His hands trembled, cameras catching every falter. By the end of the week, the empire was gone. Investors abandoned ship. Directors resigned. Lawsuits loomed. The golden boy, who had once been celebrated as a savior, was now the face of one of the fastest unravelings of a mid-tier empire in recent memory. And me, I did not need to say another word. I had spoken 3, and they had done the work for me. I watched from the corner office of my tower, the city alive beneath me, bridges, glowing traffic, pulsing 1,000 stories unfolding at once. Below, another wedding was underway at a luxury hotel courtyard. Lights strung between columns, guests laughing with champagne in hand. To me, weddings no longer symbolized beginnings. They symbolized masks, performances, families selling perfection while hiding rot. And I knew that somewhere in that ballroom, someone else was swallowing silence, someone else was being erased. But maybe, just maybe, they too would find their moment to rise. Now let me ask you, if you had the chance to end the empire that erased you, would you take it? Or would you walk away? Share your answer in the comments, because this is the choice so many of us quietly carry. Jason had been worshipped as untouchable. Now he was mocked as reckless. My parents had believed silence kept us safe. Now silence had destroyed them. And me, I had never been freer. I stood by the tall glass windows of my office, the skyline stretching out like a living monument. Bridges glowed in the night, traffic pulsed through the veins of the city, and far below, the laughter of another wedding floated upward from a luxury hotel courtyard. I watched for a long moment, remembering the last wedding I had attended, the wobbling chair by the kitchen, the smell of garlic and lamb, the sting of being erased while violins played. That humiliation could have broken me. Instead, it became the final gift they ever gave me. Because in that moment, I stopped begging for space at their table. I chose to build my own. The Monroe Group was no longer a secret lattice of investments. It was an empire. Not loud, not flashy, but strong, ethical, rooted in the communities most corporations ignored. The founders I had backed, the warehouse renovators, the fintech innovators, the women running microlending projects were thriving. Their teams grew, their workers were paid on time, and every deal carried my fingerprints, my discipline, my vision. Jason had thought Atlas defined me. My parents believed family roles bound me. Charlotte assumed my silence was compliance, but they were wrong. Power isn't in the seat you're handed. It's in the building you choose to walk out of and the one you choose to build. I remembered the question one of my young executives asked me just a week earlier. He had walked into my office late at night, a file in his hand, his expression hesitant. "Do you ever think about reconciling with them with your family?" His voice was careful, as if afraid of crossing a line. I turned from the window, studied his earnest face, too young to understand betrayal's weight. For him, family was still safety. For me, family had been a cage. I let the silence stretch before I answered, steady, certain. I wasn't meant to sit in the kitchen. I was meant to own the building. The words landed like stone. His eyes widened, then slowly he nodded. He understood, or at least he would one day. Behind me, the office buzzed phones, ringing deals, closing futures being written. The energy was alive, pulsing, full of possibility. And I was no longer the invisible one. I was at the center. Not tolerated at the edge of a banquet hall, but shaping skylines, directing legacies, building something that mattered. Jason, my mother, my father, even Charlotte, they were still clawing at the ruins, rehearsing excuses, blaming everyone but themselves. But their empire had collapsed, and mine had risen not from their approval, but from the strength they never believed I had. This was never just about revenge. It was about freedom. It was about refusing to let silence define me. It was about remembering that dignity is not something others grant. It's something you claim. And now I'll ask you one last time, have you ever been told you don't belong at the table? If so, promise yourself this: don't fight for their chair. Build your own. And if this story speaks to you, subscribe, because more stories like this are waiting, each one a reminder that the underestimated can always rise. I lifted a glass of water, not champagne, to the window. A toast, not to them, not to vengeance, but to clarity. I had been invisible once, never again. Because I didn't belong in the kitchen, I belonged here, and the building was mine. The city at night always reminds me of resilience. Lights glowing against darkness, bridges spanning divides, towers rising from ground that once held nothing but silence. When I stand by the glass in my office and look out, I don't see power. I see possibility. There was a time I believed silence meant weakness, that if I stayed quiet one day, someone would notice. But silence is not weakness, it is a choice. And when you learn to wield it, silence can be sharper than any voice in the room. That night at the wedding, I chose silence, not to endure humiliation, but to let my actions speak louder than my words ever could. What my family never understood was that dignity is not given at their table. It is not in a seat near chandeliers or a name on a program. Dignity is claimed when you walk away from those who refuse to see you and you build something of your own. The Monroe Group is not my revenge, it is my freedom. Every deal we close, every founder we support, every worker who gets paid on time is proof that my story didn't end at a kitchen-side chair. It began there. That humiliation was the seed of everything that came after. If you have ever felt invisible, remember this: you are not powerless. You are not irrelevant. You are simply waiting for the right moment to act. Do not fight to be seen at a table that was never set for you. Build your own table. Build your own building. And when you stand at its windows, you'll understand you were never meant to be small. 'Cause you too were meant to own the skyline.